morning, and welcome to Beware Spoilers. I am Adam. I have eaten today before recording for a change. I went to the doctor, and the doctor said I needed to lose weight, and he asked me which it's always a humiliating thing when you sit there and you're talking to the, and you're talking to the doctor, and it's like, so how are your dietary habits? Which is always an embarrassing question, and it's like, oh, well, I mean, you fucking weighed me, so, whatever. So, we'll talk about that more when me and Josie do Exploring Hyperspace Lanes next week, which, no episode this week because Josie was very busy, but we'll be doing it next week. So, yeah. So, today, though, we're here to talk about Star Wars, which we're talking about The Mandalorian Episode 3, which some people called filler, some people called an episode of Andor mixed in to Mandalorian. I would say this is probably my favorite episode of The Mandalorian, or one of my favorite episodes of The Mandalorian, because for me, the strongest thing that Filoni does, his best work, comes when he's recontextualizing things. So when you watch the Clone Wars, you are being recontextualized on the fall of the Republic and the fall of Anakin Skywalker, to give you more space to let that story breathe and to find out more about why that happened and how it happened in the way it did. Rebels, you're being recontextualized on, and Rebels does the same thing for the period between, and the Bad Batch too, the period between the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Resistance, and then, or not the rise of the Resistance, the rise of the Rebellion, and then Resistance, I think, does a lot of the same, but for between episodes 8 and 9, I think. I haven't watched it. But all that said, we end up in this weird place where The Mandalorian is kind of doing that same thing, but for But for the rise of the First Order, and what happens that leads to the First Order's return, or the Empire's return in the form of the First Order. So we get a lot of the, and look, let's just get the Bo-Katan and what's it called, and Manda stuff out of the way. All that stuff is great. Her bathing in the waters too and becoming part of the Night Watch is such a great character choice. I love everything about that. And then for that to happen the way it does, and for and for her to to be able to emote that kind of sense of relief and belonging at the end of the episode without having the mask off, and just in body language, is so great for Katie Sackhoff to be able to do that at the end of the episode. The whole thing though is just so interesting, and I think that building up, so Mandalore is not destroyed and Mandalore is livable because he went there and came back with proof of that. So what does that what does that mean? Because he came back with the living waters as proof. He had the foresight to be like, well, they're not going to believe me. They're probably not going to believe her because she doesn't believe in any of this bullshit. So I'm going to take some of the water with me to prove it to them that we were there and came back. But it's an interesting kind of, look at that whole Mandalorian culture. Now, that's not the part of the episode that I really loved. I mean, I didn't hate it. I'm not saying it's bad. But for me, going back to Coruscant, not just after the end of the original trilogy, which is, yes, it is after the end of the original trilogy, but also to go back to Coruscant after it had fallen back to the back to the New Republic. That's really interesting, and to see how that's working, and to see this reintegration program for Imperial officers. And I think that, like, one of the things, and I've talked about this before with Alphabet Squadron and with some of the other books, when we look at, like, what's going on with how the rebellion handled stuff in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Empire, they made a lot of really shitty decisions that allows for the Empire to come back, and not in ways where it's like, oh, we're just gonna let the Empire hang around or stuff like that. It was more like, okay, we're going to do things, and we're going to ostracize former Imperial members, and put them in a re-education camp, stuff like that. So that way this doesn't happen again, but all you end up doing is cause it to happen again. So these reintegration programs are really interesting, and with the re-education camps going into reintegration programs, and then going from that to the story of the communications officer from Gideon's ship, and I forgot his name, even though he's the main character of the entire episode, the cloning guy, going on this adventure because he wants to use cloning for the noble good, but the New Republic is like, no, we're not doing cloning. And he quickly becomes desensitized and then gets captured, and then the whole thing was designed so that way she could have his memory wiped because she didn't want him talking to the New Republic about what he was working on. And I think this whole thing is so interesting in terms of just building out what the Empire is doing, and things like, oh look, here's the highest point on Coruscant naturally. Like, there are mountains on Coruscant. We never really talked about that, but like, there is a planet there on Coruscant. And it's just like, it's so interesting to see the way they built this out. Which is why it's like, when they say, I saw people complaining like, oh, this episode's filler, I was like, I really don't think it counts as filler. Because when I think of filler, I'm like, look, if you're calling this filler, you've obviously never watched an anime before, where it's like, here's Goku and Piccolo trying to learn how to drive a fucking car because we need to wait for the manga to catch up to real time. Like, yeah, no, we don't need to do that. It's an inconsequential story. Or like the entirety of Garlic Jr. Like, it's just kind of silly that, this isn't filler. This is fleshing out the lore of the world. And I think that, like, people complain about the filler in The Last of Us, which is like, I don't think you understand what The Last of Us is meant to be doing. People complain about filler in here, and it's like, I don't think you quite understand. I think what happened was we got too many limited series shows that were A to B to C to D in terms of what the episodes were, where it's just telling one continuous story all the way through, across 8 to 10 episodes, that when we have these shows that are more like, we're going to do that, but we're also going to add more context for the world around it, it kind of gets, cast aside a little bit. And people look at it weird. What else was there? I feel like there was more. I feel like there was definitely more I wanted to address with this. Like, the whole Coruscant thing was probably my favorite thing of the episode, and I think that like, when we say, oh, it's an Andor episode, it's like, oh, they went to Coruscant, and, we learned about the inner workings of the government, and it's like, I guess that, like, people had a problem with that in the prequels, and look, I understand it in that case to an extent. I understand people who didn't like the prequels because of all of the political nonsense and all of that. I can kind of buy into that. I think that in the case of this show, I think that it's not... This is more important to lay out that political nonsense. I don't think you really necessarily needed it for the prequels to work, but I think you do need it to understand what causes civilizations, because civilizations don't just rise and fall And civilizations don't just rise and fall purely because of military issues either. There are other factors that go into it. And these, and the political actions and the social issues that are impacting the people is something that goes into that. So if you're going to tell the story about the fall, then that's it. And it's possible that we get to the refall of Coruscant relatively early on. I wouldn't be surprised, because keep in mind, again, and I think this is worth noting, at this point in galactic history, if I remember correctly, in the new canon, the Coruscant is not the seat of government for the New Republic. And it's not. I think Hosnian Prime always is. But I think what we have to look at is that this is going to be the point that, like, the fall of Coruscant back to First Order could be the thing that happens during Mandalorian times, which is what Jon Favreau sees. That there's a big event that happens here, and it's like, could that be it? And I think we got a pretty sizable Thrawn tease in this episode, where in the beginning when they're getting back to Mando's ship and he's going back to his starfighter, and I love that whole sequence with the N1 starfighter fighting the TIE fighters, and I was like, this is something I never thought I'd see, and I'm here for it. So he gets back to his starfighter and fighting all of the TIEs, and there are a fuck ton of TIEs, and he's like, this is not just an Imperial warlord, this is something bigger. And it's like, oh, is it Moff Gideon? I think it's Thrawn. Because the thing is, I think we have to look at the context of Season 2, where Ahsoka shows up and asks, where is Thrawn? It's not, is Thrawn still alive? It's, where is Thrawn? Thrawn is out there and she knows it. And I think that that's where we are. And I think the thing is, too, the telling thing is that they're not TIE fighters. They're TIE interceptors. Thrawn's thing was that he would rather invest not in the deaths. Like, that was one of the big, points of partially Rebels, but mostly treason, was that Thrawn wanted to invest heavily in the TIE Defender program. He wanted the Empire to put its money into creating these TIE fighters that had strong shields, had strong offensive abilities, and could make the jump to hyperspace in the way that it would rival a TIE fighter, where a TIE fighter didn't exactly rival an X-Wing. A TIE fighter didn't exactly rival an X-Wing because there were so many things that the TIE fighter couldn't do that the X-Wing could. And that's kind of where we are here, where it's like, oh, he's using interceptors. Whoever this is using a fuck ton of interceptors and no TIE fighters. And that is a big... I think that's the big indicator that this is Thrawn here. I think that that's kind of where we are now. Because it's like, it may not be Defenders, but the Defender program was shut down. But the Interceptors are a close second because they're more nimble, more agile, and they can get around quicker. The idea of the TIE Fighter was to do a blitz with as many as you could, so that way that whoever you were fighting couldn't have time to deal with all of them. But if you could outmaneuver them, you could outmaneuver them, and you could fuck them up. The TIE interceptors are way better at that. So I think that this could be Thrawn, and he's bombing the castle of House Kreese, and I think he has a bone to pick with Sabine, who I seem to recall is related. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm misremembering. Either way, I still think this is Thrawn and not Gideon who is doing that. But I think this is a solid point to wrap up on for today. Later today, we'll have our review of Shazam! Fury of the Gods. And we will have a review of... I feel like there's something else to do this weekend. I don't remember what it is. Oh, tomorrow we'll have The Bad Batch, and then we also have The Flash and Gotham Knights. So, until our next episode, have a great rest of your week.